I think one of the hardest things about vlogging outside is setting the correct exposure when it's sunny like this. That's why I want to give you 5 tips on how to expose correctly whilst you're outside vlogging. Now, if it's a cloudy day, you don't have to worry so much because the clouds act like a huge softbox and you get even lighting whichever way you face. But when it's a sunny day like this, you get really harsh shadows. The lighting conditions can change instantly when the sun goes behind a cloud. So it's really tricky to get right. Look, it's changing again. So I'm constantly going to have to be changing my exposure. Now, if you're new to exposure and you're not quite sure how to change, look. Oh my god, see what I mean? If you're new to exposure and you're not quite sure how to set your exposure, I've done a video up here that you can watch after this video, and it tells you all about stops of light and what you should be aiming for. So it's definitely worth checking that one out for some extra tips. The number 1 rule to bear in mind throughout all of this video is make sure that you are correctly exposed. You're the subject, so if you're too bright or too dark, that's going to be distracting. It doesn't matter if the sky is blown out, as long as people can see you clearly, that's the main thing, that's all that matters. Tip number 1, I know it sounds like something really simple and a bit boring, but it really does help. If you're filming in log, which I highly suggest you do, because you'll get the most dynamic range out of your camera, make sure that your view assist is on, or install a LUT into your camera. Because if you're filming in log, the profile is so flat, you can't always see what your shadows or your highlights look like. And then make sure your brightness of your LCD display is turned all the way up. Now, this is going to help you see a lot clearer if you're exposed properly or not, and it will make your life a lot easier. You might not always be able to do this, but if you can, find somewhere where there's a bit of shade. I'm under this sort of canopy thing, I don't know if you can see, and it's perfect under here because I'm not getting any light shining directly on me, I'm not getting any shadows, it's nice and even. But obviously if you can't get any shaded areas, then the next tips will be useful. Right, so if you're in an open space like this right now and there's no shade whatsoever, which way should you face? That's always been a thing for me. I've never known which way to face, what looks better. What you should try to avoid is facing the sun, because this is what happens. You get the shadow of the camera right in front of your face, and that just ruins everything. So try to stay away from facing the sun like that. Then if you have the sun behind you, what happens is it creates this glare. Let's expose for me now. When the sun's behind you, all the contrast and all the saturation goes, and it's really difficult to colour grade. So avoid having the sun directly behind you as well. Look at that. What I'd recommend going for is kind of like a split lighting type thing like I've got here. So I've got the sun on one side, it's just shining on this side of my face, and I've got shadow on the other side. And what that does is it keeps everything, including the background, nice and saturated. As you can see, the colours are really nice, the contrast is really good. Now you could go for kind of like a Rembrandt thing where you've got a bit more light here, like a triangle in the cheek, but then you get this nose shadow here, which people aren't that fond of. Now I'm going to do a mixture of both during this video, so let me know which one is your favourite. What do you think? Is that a problem? Does it bother you? If not, then something like this or that is probably your best bet. Like for example, if you do want to show something in this direction and the sun happens to be there, if you can do, try and aim for the sun to be just off to one side rather than directly behind you. And so you're still going to get even lighting on your face, and it doesn't matter if the background is blown out a little bit. Right, don't let this nice sunny blue sky weather fool you, because it's absolutely freezing cold and it's super windy as well. Can't wait to get in. That's why I film a lot of videos indoors, because this is just unbearable. And once you've set your exposure and you find out the best place to stand, make sure you stay there, because that means that you're going to get even exposure, nothing's going to change. If you keep moving around all the time like this, look what happens. Overexposed, underexposed, glare, not good. So make sure you set your exposure and stay where you are. Right, I'm sorry about the wind. If it's crazy windy, I'm really sorry. I'll try and sort the audio as best as I can. This is a tip that's helped me so much. So your camera might have a few different metering modes, and I would recommend switching it to spot meter rather than using the multimeter. Because what the multimeter does is it takes a reading of everything that's in the scene, and it's going to tell you the exposure of the overall picture rather than what you want to expose for. So if you've got a spot meter and you can set it to the center frame or wherever your subject is going to be or wherever you're going to be, and you can make sure that you are correctly exposed. So at the moment, my spot meter is right on my face, on the bright side of my face, to make sure that it's not over or underexposed. And currently it's flicking between 0, perfect exposure, and plus 1/3 a stop. So I know that my face is perfectly exposed. So once you've found your location and the perfect position to stand in, next we need to figure out which method we're going to use to adjust the exposure. So we can use a That's my phone. My phone dropped. I'm just going to hold it, shall I? You don't mind? Oh, great. Doesn't that look? Great. We can either use the ISO, the shutter speed, the aperture, or ND filters, and I'm going to talk about aperture versus shutter speed. Which one should you use? Now, it's subjective really, because if you want separation, then you're going to need to make sure that the background is blurry, which means having a lower f-stop. So at the moment with this lens, I can only go as low as 3.5. So it is blurry, but it's not super blurry. Now, for example, if let's do it this way. Just taking my ND filter off now, sorry for the brightness. But what I'm going to do is raise the f-stop as far as I can to try and get an exposed image. See, that's hang on. Right, this is at f22, so as far as the aperture will go, and as you can see, everything is pretty much in focus. Now that I think that looks good, it does the job. Everything looks really nice, really clear, and if you're in like a city environment or something where you want to show everything because there's a lot of interesting buildings and things going off, then that might be what you want. But what I've noticed is having separation between the person who's vlogging and the background, and having that blurry background draws the attention in. So what you could do, option 2, so I'm just going to put the aperture back to where it was. Option 2 is to crank the shutter speed really high. So we can now keep, there we go, that's at 8,000. So now I'm exposed perfectly and the background is still blur. But what happens is I've lost all my motion blur, so I'll look really jittery. So if I start moving around now while I'm vlogging, all the little bumps and everything, all the shakes will come more pronounced and it just looks a little bit unnatural. Now, I suppose for a vlog on YouTube it doesn't really matter, but it's worth bearing in mind. Let me know which is your favourite in the comments, because I don't know, I might use this a little bit more just to see what it looks like. I don't mind it. It looks alright. I would say that you have a little bit more control. I've got no ND filter on at the moment, and I'm all the way up. I'm at 8,000. Even when I went to f22, I still needed to put 2 or 3 stops of ND filter on top. So this is a good way of setting your exposure and making sure that you've got that blurry background still. Right, I've mentioned ND filters. I'm sort of flicking between 2 today, and you could get away with 1, to be fair. I've got the Polar Pro Peter McKinnon versions, the first edition, which is the 2 to 5 stop, and then the second edition, 6 to 9 stop. The 6 to 9 seems to work really well, but sometimes I just need a little bit of extra brightness with this lens especially. If you want that super blurry background and you've got an f2.8 lens, probably go for the 6 to 9, or go for the 2 to 5, but use a little bit of shutter as well, just to notch it down a little bit extra if you need. But yeah, the 2 to 5 is probably the best option, I would say, if you don't mind raising that shutter speed. Right, this is the shutter speed back to normal. I'm at 5 stops on the ND and it's f3.5. So I would need to crank the shutter a little bit. Quite a lot actually. I'm at 250 there with 5 stops of ND on, and that's perfect exposure. So that's what you'd need for that. What's the blurry like? What's the motion blur like? This is what the motion blur is like for that. Right, and now this is the 6 to 9 stop. Shutter at 180 degree again, and now I'm on 8 stops on the ND filter, f3.5, and this is what it looks like. Plus 2/3, which is what I was on last time. Nice natural motion blur. Background should be nice and blurry. This is what it looks like. So I'll leave it up to you. Which ND filter would you use? I was going to get all nerdy and use zebras on my camera, but what I found was I couldn't really see it properly on this tiny little monitor screen, so I didn't bother in the end. It was more hassle than it was worth, so I think if you stick to these tips, you'll be doing all right. The thing that makes the most difference is keeping an eye on that spot meter. You've probably noticed me checking it every now and then because it just keeps changing, because the lighting keeps changing, there's some clouds that it keeps going behind. But if you keep an eye on that spot meter, make sure it's on the brightest part of your face, you can't go wrong. That's kind of what you want to be aiming for. So yeah, the zebras are more for if you're behind the camera and you're checking exposure of something else. You can see it a lot better, especially if you've got a proper big sized monitor. But on these little screens while you're trying to vlog, there's just too much to think about. So I'd stay away from the zebras. I guess where they would come in handy is if you're just checking to make sure anything is overexposed. So that's not bad, but to check for the overall exposure of your face, it's a little bit fiddly and tricky. I just want to talk quickly about dynamic range. Different cameras have different dynamic ranges. If you can, definitely go for a log profile. That's going to give you the most dynamic range, and that'll help with giving you detail in the shadows as well as the highlights. As you can see, these clouds are nicely exposed. You can see all the detail, you can see the colours, it's nice and saturated. You can also see the detail in the shadows, and you can see the details on my face, even though that there's a shadowy part here. The better dynamic range is in your camera, the better your overall image is going to be, and it's going to be easier to expose in these conditions. If your dynamic range in your camera isn't great, then you're just going to have to do the best you can with all the other tips and make sure, I mean, I suppose the easiest thing to do is stand in the shade and then set your exposure from there, because that's going to give you the best results. Hope these tips have helped. Let me know which was your favourite in the comments. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. If you want to know how to expose for a more professional shot while you're outdoors, check this video out here. It goes into more detail and using different bits of gear. Sorry about the wind. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more how-to videos and all sorts of camera gear review type stuff. Thanks so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you all in the comments.